I want to take a few minutes to answer the kinds of questions that people ask whenever you publish a new book. Recently, I wrote a book on burnout, and so the initial question would be, what is it that motivated you to write on the subject of burnout? And I would begin by saying consistently I would counsel Christians who were overextending themselves. They were trying to do more than was human possibly to do. And I started to see that consistently they were feeling guilty for being human. They felt like they were failing God when they lived within the basic constraints of rest and sleep and family. And so I wanted to create a resource that would serve them well. People who had a passion for God and for people that was just larger than the number of hours that they had in their day, so that they could think through what they wanted to do in a way that protected themselves. Now, another question would be, what is burnout anyway? I don't think I've ever understood that term. And I think part of the reason there's not an accepted definition is because it's a popular term. It's not a clinical term. So there is no agreed upon definition. But would begin by saying a few things that burnout is not. Burnout is not just fatigue. If it was just fatigue, then a 3-day weekend we could rest and we'd be recovered and we'd be ready to go. And yes, there are times when we're tired, but when we're burnt out, it's more than just fatigue. Burnout is more than stress. If we were just stressed, then when we get to the end of that next project, there'd be a sense of release and freedom that we could get back into the game of life and feel like we were up to speed. And burnout is more than depression. While there is kind of that sense of hopelessness that both burnout and depression would share in common, depression often doesn't have that cynical feel to it that burnout does. If I were going to compare burnout to something, I might compare it to a midlife crisis that you can have at any age. That those things that you hope for that were going to bring you life and satisfaction, that as you get closer to them, you realize that they were kind of like an oasis in the desert. They were this mirage that once you get there, there wasn't the relief and benefit that you wanted to get from that, and so life just begins to feel kind of pointless. And another question that would be pretty obvious is what causes burnout? And at one level, burnout is caused by being passionate about what you do. People who aren't passionate about what they do, that aren't excited about giving themselves to the things that they're doing, typically don't get burnt out. They're looking for any opportunity to take a break or a rest whenever they can get it. Now, it's not just passion. I think another aspect that comes into play is when we live beyond our means. Now, most often when we hear the phrase living beyond our means, we think of finances. But I think that also comes into play with time, where we just commit to more than we can do, and then we feel the pressure of living up to those commitments. Now, passionate, living beyond our means, I think another piece has to come into play there for burnout to really take root. And that's when we begin to motivate ourselves by guilt. When we can't do the things that we feel like we ought to do, and so we beat ourselves up emotionally and spiritually, feeling like we ought to, that all of these good things have to get done, or it's all going to be my fault. And then I think another thing that causes burnout in with that is when the exhaustion, when the weakness that we feel, we begin to keep that secret from the people that care for us and that we're caring for. And so this cynical nature of being taken advantage of begins to cut us off from those that would help replenish us, who would come alongside of us. And then also we perpetually see ourselves as being taken advantage of. Now, another question would be, what are some of the main takeaways that I would get from your book on burnout? And I'll give you two. The first is that God's will fits within God's provision. To me, that statement has been revolutionary because I'm the kind of person who can easily come up with 200, 250 hours worth of good stuff that I want to get done every week. And that's before I take a break to sin. But when I realized that God's will fits within God's provision, that God gave me a 168-hour week, and that what God wants me to do fits within that time, so that if I have 200 hours worth of good stuff that I want to get done in a week, I can rest in the fact that at least 32 hours of that is outside the will of God, not because it's bad, but because He's fair. And a second big idea that goes alongside with that is that God often honors our finiteness more than we do. I want to beat myself up for being a finite human being who needs to sleep at least 50 hours a week, who requires some form of recreation. Sometimes I view that as something that's bad instead of part of God's design where He honored me as a finite human being and He gave me these areas of weakness so that I would see that everything that I do that's productive is by His grace and His empowerment. And so those are two big ideas. And the next question might be, well, what else am I going to get from the booklet? Well, some of the things that you'll find in there is a tool to help you create a time budget. Many of us know what it's like to create a financial budget, whether we actually do it or not. But the idea of having a time budget where we could lay out what our priorities look like within a 168-hour week is not something we've ever seen or thought of. You'll get some assessments that help you figure out what are the things that motivate me to get to the point of burnout. None of us burn out because of document deficiency disorder. It's not as if the time budget is the thing that's going to rescue us from burnout. But there are certain motives that drive our heart that we think it's worth it to pursue, even when inherently we know it's foolish to try to do more than we're capable of doing. You'll get a list of red flags that would help you see when is burnout occurring. And then some life practices that help you recover so that if you begin to sense that, yes, I have overextended myself and I'm beginning to experience burnout, how do I pull back from that in a way that's healthy without just dropping everything that's on my plate? Now, if you're intrigued, below this video, I'm going to put the opening case study of a gentleman that I named Bob. I think you'll find in Bob's life a lot of the key elements of many people who've grown exhausted and maybe even cynical in their walk with God because they couldn't rest in God's fairness as they strove to share God's greatness with the world. I hope this resource can be of benefit to you and many others as you have a great passion to share God with everyone around you, but that you'll be able to do that in a way that rests in God's fairness and His love for you.